Sondheim said, "What keeps theater alive is reinterpretation. It's changeable. Each generation brings new ways of looking at a play." When I started this year, I knew that I wanted to research something with theater because it's something that I'm truly passionate about. I originally intended to research something about how regional theaters selected their shows for each production, but I found that that really isn't the case because it depends more on contracts with tours and the location of the theater. So I decided to shift my project to examine trends of BIPOC representation across Golden Age Broadway revivals. BIPOC is a blanket term for Black, Indigenous, people of color, and this is really an encompassing term, and it doesn't define all racial and ethnic identities, but it's the term I chose to use because it is the most encompassing for the purposes of my research. And Golden Age is the period of Broadway from 1943 to 1959, and it's regarded as a period of social shift and popularization of musicals. So when I was conducting my study, I really came to the question how have revivals of Golden Age Broadway musicals evolved their content and casting to be more inclusive for a contemporary audience. And with this, I hypothesized that as visual representation increased on stage, so would the way in which content is presented and inclusivity across the board on stage. Jumping right into my literature review, I found a number of sources that were incredibly beneficial to my project. One being the Asian American Performers Action Coalition, or the AAPAC, which is a nonprofit working to bring visibility to minority actors in the New York area. This study covered regional theaters, nonprofit theaters, off-Broadway theaters, and Broadway theaters. And from this study, it was found that 80.5% of works were produced by white writers on stage. So there's a large discrepancy between the population of New York versus the types of works that are being presented on stage, because the majority of New York City is comprised of minorities, while most of the stories being told are by white people. Furthermore, it was also found that 58.6% of roles were given to white performers, and 22.7% of roles were casted and hired without regard to a person's race. And although there are a lot of factors that go into casting, it's really important to note that the population discrepancies in New York City do tie into this, and it's really alarming that the majority of them were taken into solely because, were not hired potentially solely because of their race. And also, this study found that from the previous season, BIPOC representation on Broadway plummeted 9%, and considering the population we're dealing with, that is a very large discrepancy. Moving on, my literature review also contains many themes of ethnic parity, and this is described by Angela Powell, Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at Indiana University, who notes that traditionally, historically ethnic characters in plays and musicals have been used as comic relief characters and played off as the butt of a joke, rather than having their own personality. This is shown in productions such as West Side Story and The Flower Dome Song, which, although they break many Latino and Asian American stereotypes, there are still many ethnic jokes within those productions that have evolved and changed across the years to be more inclusive, but the original productions and their intent did have many jokes playing on the race of those characters. This is also described by Marianne Dunbar, with a doctorate in English from Indiana University, who focuses on discrimination and assimilation being the main purpose of an ethnic character rather than their personality, which inherently alienates ethnic audiences and characters because the character is specifically tied to a social issue rather than their personality driving the story. Moving on, I also found many hints of microaggressions and interpretations within my literature review, which is touched upon by Peter Erickson, a visiting resident scholar at Northwestern University, who shows that many productions have ethnic characters. They were originally done in black or yellowface, and many productions did not make changes across the years. They just simply casted them accurately when there were other jokes that played on the idea of blackface or yellowface. Furthermore, Robin Brion, an administrator for museum studies at the University of Toronto, argues that that Showboat, a production which contained the character Queenie, plays on blackface and racial caricature and stereotyping within that production. Over the course of revivals, it was actually debated on whether to omit Queenie from that production, and it was actually voted on to keep Queenie in order to honor Hammerstein, the creator of the musical. So it begs the question, where's the place for evolving text and omitting certain characters that are racially insensitive or poorly demonstrated in the theater community? And all of these sources really just brought me to one idea. I was inspired by the AAPAC's study on ethnic demographics to conduct a mixed methods content analysis by going off of their study and also including content and literary analysis that was found in the other studies, and also conducting surveys and interviews to further my own understanding and the findings of the rest of the study. It's also important to note that I chose to do this study because over the course of as a whole, I was unable to find many studies that examine trends across the board, and rather there were many studies on 2018, 2019, 2020, not say from 1943 to 2018. So it's a really interesting topic to see how things have evolved over the years. So within my content analysis, I conducted an ethnic identity analysis of performers from the original Broadway cast to the most recent Broadway revival and production in order to show evolution across the years. On each of the scripts that I analyzed, I conducted litmus tests and coding analysis to identify themes in casting and text to find the inclusivity of the show. And lastly, I conducted surveys and interviews to gain a better understanding of the general views of representation. The criteria for musical selection, I chose 10 shows due to time restrictions and in order to fully examine text without limitations. The parameters for the selection was that they must have been a Golden Age Broadway musical, have had 2 or more revivals or adaptations of some degree, and be relatively recognizable throughout pop culture. The shows that I selected were West Side Story, Music Man, Carousel, South Pacific, My Fair Lady, Oklahoma, Guys and Dolls, King and I, Peter Pan, and Kiss Me Kate. All 10 of these shows were used in literary and textual analysis. I was unable to find full casting data for South Pacific and Peter Pan, so those were omitted from that portion of the study just due to limitations and not being able to make a full conclusion with those two casts. Jumping right into my analysis, we're looking at the cast of West Side Story. The original cast of West Side Story was 66.7% white, whereas the 2019 revival was around 30.5% white. So taking into account that this show is relatively based around 2 gangs, 1 Puerto Rican, 1 white, it's really important to note that the original show was majority white and it was not fully able to encapsulate the scope of Latino culture and heritage. Another show which also showed a large shift was The King and I. The original Broadway cast of The King and I was almost half and half split between Asian and white characters. The 2018 revival was only 7% white, and the rest were all Asian identifying characters. And the rest of the cast members were all Asian identifying. So it's really important to note that the culture being portrayed has become more authentic over the years because we're portraying it with ethnic actors who understand the culture that they are portraying. These were the only 2 shows that actually had a majority-minority casting in the revival productions. However, all other productions did show an increase in minority characters from the original cast to the most recent revival. The original cast of Oklahoma was 77.3% white, with 2.3% African American, and 20.5% were unable to be determined simply due to access to casting data and images due to the age of the show. However, the 2019 revival was much more evenly split. There were only two demographics within this cast, 61.5% white and 38.5% African American, but this is still a significant increase, and this this trends across the board of the other 7 shows which I have not mentioned. So how did today's shows measure up? As you can see here, this is a graph of the number of white cast members per revival. And as you can see, as we mentioned before, The King and I and West Side Story are shows which are the only 2 shows that are not majority white. But the other shows, comparatively, did also have relatively impressive diversity standpoints considering the show. I found that shows which tackled ideas of racial disparity and discrimination tended to have higher ethnic and racial demographics than the shows that did not. Moving on to script analysis. I conducted coding analysis and litmus tests where I used different forms of thematic analysis. One such test was the Shulka test, which is similar to the Bechdel test, which is a qualifier for female representation in film and television. The Shulka test states that a show must have 2 or more BIPOC characters who talk to each other and about something other than their race. After reading through all the scripts, I found that only 4 shows qualified, and the show which qualified the most only had 5 scenes of that entire show which qualified, which that counts into casting and shows that although diversity has increased largely, those characters don't seem to be interacting as much on stage as one might think. And with this, I found 4 common themes on top of the Shulka test within these scripts. 1, many contain themes of colonization, assimilation. 2, Western culture. 3, native caricature. And 4, tokenism. So I found themes of colonization and assimilation, or the idea of changing your principal culture to fit into society. Now, both of the interviews that I conducted did contain themes of this, and 7 out of 10 of the show scripts also contained these themes. One such example is in The King and I. After the king dies, the young prince makes the decision to abandon the country of Siam's exotic ways in order to assimilate into Eurocentric Western culture at the time. Secondly, Western culture, or the idea of Eurocentrism in a show. Only 1 of my interviews exhibited this theme, and 9 out of 10 of the show scripts did exhibit this theme as well. And this is just perpetuating the idea of Eurocentrism and the idea that there's not as much room for diverse cultures in theater, and that just plays into when these musicals were produced and the time period and era that this occurred. Third, Native American caricature was a very important theme that I found, and that means the inappropriate depictions of Native cultures in a way that makes a joke. Both of my interviewees expressed ideas of this in their responses to my interviews, and then 4 out of 10 of the show scripts also contained themes of this. One of the most prominent was in The Music Man, where in the original cast and also in the educational script that I received to read, they contained a patriotic tableau where they dressed up as Native characters and shouted different phrases and words in order to sound like Native American languages, which in reality plays no actual accurate representation to Native American culture. Lastly, I found a large theme of tokenism, or having a person in a show just for the sake of having a BIPOC performer in the show. For example, the stereotypical Asian best friend trope. Both of my interviewees did express themes of this, and 3 out of 10 show scripts also express themes of this. It's really important to note that my example for this one, the actor who portrays this only once has been a POC person, and that is the character of Ali Hakam in Oklahoma. He is described as a Persian peddler man who travels around with exotic goods and is one of Ado Annie's main love interests throughout the musical. And he makes references to Middle Eastern culture and history and makes jokes that plays on Middle Eastern culture when the actor has actually never been POC himself or Middle Eastern. So it's really important to note that many shows do contain tokenism, but the casting's not always accurate, so it gets kind of ignored and brushed under the table. The last part of my study was surveys and interviews. Out of the 51 surveys that I emailed out, I received 11 respondents, 10 students, and one from one female theater professional. From that, I had 2 surveys that I really narrowed down and identified as people that I would like to interview. It's important to note that all participants also have participated in a production of a Golden Age show. Now, one of the interviewees that I selected mentioned in her interview something that really stunned me, and that plays into the idea of tokenism in theater. She mentioned that when she goes into the audition room, she sits there and evaluates the room. In some cases, she is the only person in the room who is POC. And she walks in, and she said that she would sometimes play on the joke of her minority in order to get noticed in the room. So putting minority actors in this position is really important to note because we're supposed to be creating a safe space in theater, and that's something that we need to change. And from this data, I also found that 60% of survey participants, when asked, has race played a role in your casting, 60% said yes. All participants said representation was important in theater, and all participants also said that evolving classical texts to be more relevant to current issues is important, showing that there is a general consensus that representation in theater is important, although due to the small sample size, I was unable to make a full conclusion. Another one of my interviewees stated, "It's just reclaiming minorities. I feel like having just 2 or 3 people fully Caucasian and everyone else is POC, it definitely means a lot because they've never really been taken into account as much." And that's just a really important sentiment to know as we go into future directions and conclusions. In the future, I would increase the pool of study participants and also the number of shows that are analyzed. I would also ask for more time. This study was extremely limited due to time restrictions, and I was unable to fully complete all of the shows that I wanted to. I would have much preferred a lot more time to fully research everything. And lastly, access to databases. Although I was able to find all my data, I did mention that I had trouble finding some of the casting data, and then I also had to get my scripts from licensing companies, which restricted me from mentioning them in my paper and in this presentation due to copyright issues. What are we taking away from this? We should acknowledge diversity in theater, and that's really important to note because some productions that I've already mentioned in here have been doing that already. For example, the touring production of Oklahoma at every performance acknowledges the native land that they have been on. This is a small step and may be performative, but it does demonstrate a clear shift and acknowledgement of representation. Second, culturally aware theater. We should be changing theater to evolve to be more culturally appropriate and relevant. I'm looking at Music Man and The King and I, which had a lot of racial paraphernalia in their original productions, which are omitted from their revival productions. And lastly, increased physical representation is just really important because the more people see themselves on stage, the more they're going to engage in theater. And just to round it out, again with Sondheim, he said, "The world's changed a lot since 1957, and as a result, theater should too."
Thank you, Molly. So just a few quick questions for you. Just to reiterate, I will begin with the first question. Your expert advisor will ask the second, and then the third panelist will ask the third. So Molly, how did your initial exploration into the literature help you finalize your research question?
So my initial exploration into the literature, I started by looking for specific letters and opinion pieces on representation just to really define it because I myself am not a minority. I identify as a white female. So trying to find general sentiment on this project and on the study was really important going into this project because I know I'm speaking from a point of privilege. So going into that and then from finding that information and taking it and finding all of the diversity reports and all of the sentiments written by POC authors on the subject really helped me to shape a well-rounded idea around my research question.
Thank you.
Great job. What are the real-world implications or consequences related to your findings?
So I think that one of the real world implications has a large educational effect on people, because representation doesn't just mean there's physical actors on a stage. There are students that come to shows, there are children that come to shows. So by examining and reevaluating the content that's presented on stage and making sure that there's no inappropriate depictions, there's no caricatures of different cultures, and making sure that everyone is fully informed and cultures are presented in an accurate and well-informed way is really important, and could shape theater and education and help more people get involved in this topic, and also bring awareness to disparities amongst minority populations.
Thank you.
Okay. How did your expert advisor facilitate your deeper understanding of the research process?
So my expert advisor I actually had the pleasure of working with last summer at the Hanover Theater when I was in a production of Oklahoma, which is part of the reason why I was so inspired to do this project. When we were talking, I was originally going to shape my project around regional theaters, and I quickly realized that that was not a feasible option to do with this project. So we kind of reevaluated and reshaped my research question to be around something that we both already know a lot about. We know a lot about theater, and then the Hanover has done a couple productions. They've done Music Man in the past, they've done Guys and Dolls in the past, and they recently did Oklahoma. So having that knowledge behind the research study and behind my expert advisor was really important, and helping me to shape my project in order to fully understand and encompass the ideas around my study.
Thank you.